Listen to me, brothers. You feel it in your chest, don't you? That hunger, that rage gnawing at your ribs like a starving wolf. Tomorrow the Trojans will pour from their gates, their bronze flashing like fire, their shouts rising like thunder. They think we are weary. They think we have lost heart. But they have never stood against me when my blood runs hot. When I strike, you strike. When my spear finds flesh, your blades will follow. We are not shadows on this shore. We are storm and steel, and we will drown their cries in dust and blood. Do you hear me, Patroclus? My brother in spirit, my second heart, stand at my side. When the walls shake and the chariots scream, you will see me blaze brighter than any torch. And you, every one of you, remember your names, remember your fathers, remember the songs yet to be sung of your deeds. I will not die here, not while Troy still breathes. Their king, their prince, their walls, their gods, I will break them all. And when I fall, if the fates demand it, let it be with the world watching, with the dust of Troy choking the sky. So steel yourselves. Grip your shields until your fingers ache. Tomorrow the world learns the fury of Achilles.
Tonight, we step into the mind of Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, as he stands on the brink of the Trojan War. This isn't the whole saga of his life. It's a single moment stretched wide, a window into the days of fire, sand, blood, and unbreakable will. But before we dive into the fury and the glory, I want you to settle in. Put your phone on full screen, dim the lights, and let yourself fall into the rhythm of this story. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Every time, it amazes me how people across the world gather here like warriors around a single campfire, sharing the same flame of imagination. Now, let's step onto the battlefield. The camp of the Greeks hummed like a hive beneath the dark sky. Torches burned low, their smoke curling upward in twisting threads as if trying to climb toward the stars. The sea was restless behind them, waves rolling with a ceaseless murmur like the gods whispering from the deep. Achilles sat apart from the others, sharpening the edge of his spear until the bronze glimmered faintly in the firelight. Around him, his myrmidons murmured in low voices, some laughing too loudly to hide their nerves, others crouched in silence, staring at their shields as though the patterns carved upon them could offer prophecy. It was the night before battle, and the air carried that heavy stillness that comes only when men know death waits within reach of the next sunrise. For all his renown, for all the songs already sung of him, Achilles was no different in this moment. He too felt the weight of what was to come. The plains before Troy were endless, flat and open, with nowhere to hide from the clash of bronze. Tomorrow, the two armies would thunder across them, and blood would soak the earth until the soil itself could not hold more. Yet if fear stirred in him, it was a shadow far beneath the fire that burned brighter. Hunger. The hunger not merely for victory, but for remembrance. Men came and went like waves on the shore, but names could be carved into eternity. That was what Achilles sought. Glory, eternal and unbreakable. Still, the night had its own rituals. Across the camp, men poured wine to the gods, their cups tipped toward the black sky. They made offerings to Ares, to Athena, to any power who might tilt tomorrow's battle in their favor. Achilles gave little thought to such gestures. He had always been both favored and cursed by Olympus. No prayer could change that. Instead, his devotion was to the steel in his hand, the muscles in his arms, and the men who sat with him now, their eyes bright with faith in his command. Patroclus came quietly to his side, as he often did when the camp grew loud and restless. He carried no weapon tonight, only a wineskin, and he crouched beside Achilles with a soft exhale. They speak of omens, he said, his voice calm, as though he were commenting on the weather. An eagle was seen at dusk, flying toward Troy. Some say it promises their victory. Achilles gave a short laugh, though his gaze remained fixed on the blade of his spear. Birds do not decide wars, men do, and gods meddle when it pleases them. Let them. I'll cut through their omens as easily as I cut through flesh. Patroclus studied him for a long moment, the firelight flickering across his face. He knew Achilles well enough not to argue, yet beneath his quiet expression was the unspoken worry he always carried. The awareness that Achilles did not just fight battles, he consumed them, body and soul, until nothing remained but the thirst for more. Around them, the soldiers sang. It was not a merry tune, nor even a confident one. It was raw, rough at the edges, a rhythm of men clinging to something larger than themselves. The kind of song that carried their fear into the open air, where it could be shared instead of hidden. Achilles listened, the corners of his mouth lifting faintly. He liked that sound. It was the sound of men preparing to die, yet refusing to let fear silence them. At the edges of the firelight, old Nestor's voice carried across the camp, instructing his warriors with endless stories of battles past. Odysseus argued with Agamemnon over strategy, their tones sharp enough to cut the night itself. And in the shadows, sentries kept watch on the plain, where faint torchlight flickered from the walls of Troy, as if the enemy were also awake, staring across the dark gulf that separated them. The night stretched on. Some men slept, clutching their spears even in dreams. Others drank too deeply, hoping to silence the thunder in their chests. Achilles remained awake, restless, pacing the edges of his camp. His armor lay beside him, polished and gleaming, every curve of the bronze a reflection of the smith's godlike craft. He ran his hand across the chest plate, feeling the cold metal. Tomorrow it would be warm, warmed by his body and perhaps by blood. Patroclus approached him once more, softer this time. "You should rest," he urged. "Even lions sleep before they hunt." Achilles glanced toward him, and for a moment, the hard edges of his face softened. "And do lions dream, Patroclus? Do they dream of the kill before it comes? Because if so, then I am already dreaming." The words carried a weight between them, heavier than either wished to admit. For all his talk of glory, Achilles knew the prophecy that hung over him, that his life would burn brightly but briefly, and that Troy's fall would carry him with it. Perhaps that was why he sharpened his spear with such care, why he stared at the horizon as though it already belonged to him. Time was short, and tomorrow it would shorten still. The camp slowly quieted, the fires burning low until only embers glowed red in the sand. Achilles stood long after most had closed their eyes, his gaze fixed upon Troy's distant walls, barely visible against the starlit plain. He could almost hear the heartbeat of the city, steady and strong, daring him to come. When at last he lay down, it was not to sleep, but to wait. For dawn, for war, for glory. And though the night was silent, his mind was filled with the roar of tomorrow's battle, already thundering in his chest. The dawn came with a sharpness that felt almost cruel. The sun leapt above the horizon like a blade being unsheathed, flooding the plains with gold that quickly turned to white heat. The dew had barely begun to steam off the grass before the war horn sounded. Achilles rose with the first blast, already awake, already armored. His bronze plates clung to him like a second skin, polished so brightly they caught the sun and threw it back in blinding sparks. He slid the helmet down over his head, and the world narrowed to the slit of bronze vision. The sound of the camp shifted, shouts muffled, the pounding of feet suddenly distant, as if the helmet itself transported him into another world, a world of war. The Myrmidons assembled quickly, disciplined as ever. They stood in perfect ranks, spears bristling like a forest of iron, shields overlapping in a wall of bronze. Their dark armor set them apart from the rest of the Greek army. There was a grimness to them, a silence that hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. They were not the largest force among the Greeks, but under Achilles, they carried the weight of a storm. Across the plain, the Trojans spilled from their gates in waves. Their armor gleamed in the morning light. Their banners snapped in the wind, and the ground trembled with the march of thousands of feet. The sound of their war cries rolled across the fields like surf crashing against the cliffs. From a distance, they seemed unending, a tide of men pouring forth to meet the invaders. Achilles mounted his chariot, the reins tight in his hands. His horses, immortal gifts from the gods, their manes glimmering as though dusted with sunlight, stamped impatiently, eager to charge. Patroclus stood at his side for a moment, though he would not ride into the first assault. His eyes met Achilles, and there was no need for words. Patroclus knew. Once the gates of battle opened, his friend was no longer a man, but a force, impossible to rein back until the fury inside him burned itself to ash. The horn sounded again, and with a cry that tore from his throat like thunder, Achilles surged forward. His chariot leapt into motion, wheels grinding against the earth, his horses pulling with godlike speed. Behind him, the Myrmidons advanced as one, their shields locked, their formation cutting through the Greek ranks like a spearhead. The first collision came with a violence that defied reason. The Trojans, charging full force, met the Greek front in a crash of bronze on bronze, flesh on iron. The air filled with the ringing of steel, the guttural shouts of men, the scream of horses. Spears snapped like kindling, shields splintered, and the soil that had been wet with dew now grew slick with blood. Achilles struck like a flame in the center of it all. His spear found its mark with deadly precision, sliding beneath a Trojan's shield to pierce his chest. The man fell, and before his body even struck the ground, Achilles' sword had already cleaved through another. His movements were not frantic, but terrifyingly precise. Every swing an answer, every strike a certainty. The Myrmidons pressed behind him, their discipline holding the line where chaos might otherwise break it. Together they carved a path into the Trojan host, cutting down man after man. To fight near Achilles was to stand in the eye of a storm. Death swirled around him, but he himself was untouchable, driving ever forward. And yet, the Trojans were no cowards. They rallied quickly, their commanders shouting, banners rising above the melee. Among them, Hector's presence could be felt even from afar. He had not yet entered the fray, but the men looked to him, their courage rekindled by the promise of his leadership. The battlefield became a sea of dust and cries. The clash of shields reverberated through the air until it seemed the very ground might split apart. Achilles' spear snapped in half from the force of a kill, but he cast the broken shaft aside and drew his sword without pause. Bronze bit into flesh, into bone, his arms ached from the weight of each strike, but the ache was swallowed by the fire in his chest. He saw the fear in their eyes, the way the Trojans hesitated when they realized whose shadow had fallen upon them. They whispered his name even as they died. Achilles, the killer of men, the god-born. In the chaos, one Trojan prince, Aeneas, son of Anchises, drove his chariot toward Achilles, hoping to meet him head-on. Their spears crossed with a crack like thunder. Aeneas fought bravely, his skill undeniable, but the ground itself seemed to resist him when set against Achilles. For a heartbeat, it seemed they would clash to the death, but the gods, ever watchful, swept Aeneas away in a shroud of mist. Achilles snarled in frustration, his fury rising at the meddling of Olympus. The fight raged on. Greek cries rose as the Myrmidons pushed deeper, their momentum unstoppable. The Trojans began to falter, their lines bending under the pressure. Achilles' chariot wheels were red now, slick with gore, splattering the earth as he surged across the plain. And still, he was unsatisfied. For every man who fell, another rose to take his place. His spear struck, his blade cut, yet it was not enough. His hunger was not for nameless men, but for champions. For Hector. For the heart of Troy itself. Until that duel came, every kill was only fuel, only kindling to stoke the fire of his wrath. By midday, the field was littered with bodies. Armor lay shattered in the dust, weapons broken, blood soaking into the soil. The cries of the wounded echoed long after the clash had passed them by. Achilles stood among it, chest heaving, eyes burning like coals beneath his helmet. Around him, the Myrmidons gathered, their ranks bloodied but unbroken. He lifted his sword high, and the sun caught its edge, scattering light across the plain. The Greek army roared behind him, their spirits lifted by the devastation he had wrought. Even those who despised him could not deny the truth. When Achilles fought, the Greeks were unstoppable. But across the plain, beyond the broken ranks of Trojans, the gates of Troy still loomed, and somewhere behind those walls, Hector waited. Achilles knew then that the first clash was only the beginning. The real war, the war that would test his fury, his pride, and his very fate, was yet to come. The battlefield did not quiet after that first collision. It only grew louder, swelling into a storm that had no end. By midday, the plain of Troy was alive with a single sound, the roar of war. Not the cry of one man or 1,000, but the combined thunder of clashing shields, pounding feet, the shriek of spears splitting the air. It rolled and rolled without pause, drowning every thought beneath its relentless surge. Achilles pressed forward at the head of his Myrmidons, their bronze armor blackened with dust and spattered with blood. The air was thick with it now, iron-scented and cloying, mixing with the sweat that poured from every body under the merciless sun. The ground was no longer green, but churned red-brown, mud forming where blood soaked too deep to vanish. Everywhere, men locked in duels, shields hammering against shields, swords sparking as they scraped bronze to bronze. The noise was unbearable, a constant rattle and crash, punctuated only by the screams of the wounded. It was as if the earth itself had become a great forge, and the hammering of battle was shaping it into something new, something monstrous. From his chariot, Achilles saw it all. The swaying lines, the surges and retreats, the chaos that turned order into madness within moments. He drove his horses straight into the thick of it, scattering Trojans before him, his spear thrusting with precision. Each kill was swift, brutal, but there was no time to linger. Another foe always pressed forward. Another sword sought his throat. The Myrmidons fought with ferocity unmatched, their ranks holding firm while other Greeks faltered. To their right, Menelaus and his men wavered under a Trojan charge. To their left, Ajax the Great bellowed, his colossal shield holding back 3 men at once. The tide shifted constantly, like the sea rolling against rocks, surging forward, retreating, then crashing again. Achilles' voice rose above the din, carrying to his soldiers like a beacon. "Hold the line! Strike as one!" His words cut through the noise, sharper than steel. His men responded instantly, their formation snapping tighter, their thrusts coordinated, spears punching through gaps in Trojan armor. But even Achilles could not ignore the weight of the endless press. Sweat stung his eyes, his arms heavy with the repetition of killing. His lungs burned with each breath, his heart hammering in his chest, as though it would break free. War was no dance. It was a grindstone, stripping flesh, blunting edges, wearing down even the strongest. And yet, he would not relent. With every swing of his blade, every thrust of his spear, he shouted his defiance to the plain itself. The roar of battle answered him, swallowing his voice but carrying its spirit outward. Men fought harder in his presence, struck with greater fury, as though his fire had leapt from his chest into theirs. By afternoon, the ground was so littered with bodies that men stumbled over the dead more than they clashed with the living. Horses screamed, arrows hissed overhead, and the smell of death hung thick and unshakable. Still, the battle gave no end. It stretched onward, relentless, until the sun itself seemed to tire, sinking lower toward the horizon, as though weary of watching such carnage. As the light dimmed, Achilles drove his chariot once more into the heart of the Trojans, his blade flashing with every strike. Around him, the roar of the plains did not fade. It deepened, resonating not only in the ears of men, but in their bones, their blood, as though the battlefield itself had become alive, a beast devouring all who stood upon it. When the horn finally called for retreat, it was not silence that followed, but a stunned, ringing emptiness. The men staggered back toward their camps, dragging the wounded, leaving the dead. The plain, once filled with motion, lay still at last, but it seemed to hum beneath the surface, the echo of the day's roar lingering like thunder after lightning has struck. Achilles did not rest. He stood upon his chariot, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the gates of Troy. The roar of the plains was still in him, and he knew it would not leave until he stood before Hector himself. The war was not only a sea of nameless men. Within the chaos, certain faces rose above the rest. Warriors who carried the pride of Troy in their blades. Champions whose names would not fade into obscurity. On the third day, Achilles met them. The Greeks surged early, pushing deep into Trojan lines. Dust rose thick, stinging eyes, choking throats, and through it, Achilles saw a figure in scarlet armor, his helm adorned with horsehair that streamed like fire. A Trojan prince, confident, defiant, his spear steady in his grasp. "Achilles!" the man roared, voice carrying even above the din. "Face me!" The clash was immediate, a storm within the greater storm. Their spears struck, shields shuddered under impact. The Trojan moved with speed, his strikes fierce and practiced. But Achilles was faster, his blade cutting arcs that forced the prince back. With a final thrust, Achilles pierced his thigh, sending him sprawling. The man's eyes burned with fury even as he fell, but before Achilles could finish him, the Trojans surged to drag their prince away. Achilles snarled, frustrated. Another face, another name half lost to the tide. It was glory denied, a kill stolen, and it gnawed at him like hunger. More champions came, a tall warrior wielding twin axes, his roars shaking the air. Achilles cut him down with a slash across the throat. Another, armored in black, whose shield bore the sigil of Apollo, Achilles drove him into the dirt, his spear through the chest. Each kill echoed across the plain, shouted by Greek voices, whispered in Trojan despair. Yet none of them were Hector. Always, Hector lingered in the distance, leading charges, rallying his men, his presence unmistakable even when he stood far away. Achilles felt him like a shadow at the edge of vision, a force pulling him forward. The duel was inevitable, written into the marrow of the war. But fate, or the gods, or Hector's own restraint, kept it at bay. Achilles' frustration grew. He sought out the strongest, the proudest, the men whose names carried weight, and one by one, he struck them down. Still, he craved the one face that would make all others pale in comparison. The battlefield itself seemed to conspire against him, throwing champions in his path, but never the one he desired. He began to fight with a kind of reckless ferocity, driving deeper into Trojan lines than any sane man would dare. His myrmidons followed, loyal but strained, cutting through resistance even as they risked encirclement. That night, around the fires, men spoke in hushed voices of the faces Achilles had taken from Troy. Fathers, brothers, princes, each name a wound carved into the city's heart. The Trojans mourned, and their hatred for Achilles burned hotter with every passing day. But Achilles himself was restless. He had seen many faces fall beneath his blade, and still it was not enough. His dreams were filled with Hector's eyes, not yet met, not yet conquered. Until that moment came, every other face was only a prelude, a hollow note in the greater song. He sharpened his spear again, the sound of stone on bronze rasping through the night. Around him, the camp fell into uneasy silence. The faces of the enemy haunted his men too, but for Achilles, they were fuel. Each one was a step closer to the duel he desired, the glory he demanded. And in Troy, Hector surely sharpened his own blade, waiting. The war was never just men against men. The plain of Troy was also a stage for immortals, their hands invisible yet unmistakable in the flow of battle. Achilles had always felt their presence, like a heat at the back of his neck, a pressure in the air before lightning strikes. On the fourth day, the gods ceased hiding their games. It began with Apollo. The sun god stood unseen atop Troy's walls, his golden bow in hand. A streak of fire lit the sky, and arrows rained down upon the Greeks. Men dropped where they stood, their shields no defense against shafts guided by a divine hand. Panic rippled through the ranks as cries rose. "The god strikes us! Apollo is against us!" Achilles bared his teeth inside his helmet. He knew the signs of divine meddling, and rage burned hotter in him than fear. He thrust his spear skyward and shouted, "Even the gods fear to face me with steel. Let them strike from shadows. I will answer in blood." The Myrmidons roared with him, their courage rekindled. Yet still, Apollo's shafts found their marks. The Greeks fell back, shields raised toward the heavens as much as toward the Trojans before them. Then Athena came. The goddess of wisdom and war strategy appeared in silence, her form invisible to most, but Achilles knew her instantly. She whispered at his side, her voice steady as stone. "Strike the left flank. Their line is weak there. Break them, and the sun god's arrows will fall short." He obeyed, whether out of faith or stubborn curiosity. Driving his chariot toward the weak point, Achilles shattered the Trojan line like a hammer through pottery. The Myrmidons surged behind him, spears stabbing, shields crushing. In moments, the balance shifted, the gods' unseen tug-of-war playing out in mortal blood. But the immortals were not done. Hera, queen of Olympus, stirred the Greeks with sudden fire. Men who moments ago faltered now shouted with fury, their fear burned away. Zeus, angered by her meddling, unleashed thunder over the plain. The sky itself growled, clouds churning though no storm had been seen on the horizon. Bolts of lightning struck, splitting trees and setting dry grass ablaze. Men scattered like insects before the wrath of heaven. Achilles fought through it all, his fury only sharpening. "Let the sky fall," he shouted. "I will carve my glory from its ruins." His blade flashed, bronze singing as it clashed with Trojan steel. The roar of thunder merged with the clash of men until it seemed Olympus itself had descended into the war. One moment burned brightest in memory. A Trojan warrior, brave and reckless, lunged at Achilles. But before his spear could land, it struck the invisible hand of a god. The weapon snapped midair, shattering into splinters. The man froze, terror flooding his face. Achilles struck him down without hesitation, but his mind raced. Who had turned the blow aside? Athena again? Or some darker power who favored him in secret? The meddling of gods left men unsettled. By nightfall, both Greeks and Trojans muttered around their fires. They knew now that their fates were not their own, that unseen hands tugged at their strings. Some grew fearful, others furious, but none more so than Achilles. For if the gods would play their games, then so would he. He sharpened his spear by firelight, muttering, "Let them come. I'll kill Trojans, Greeks, or gods themselves if they stand in my way." And in the darkness beyond the camp, Apollo listened. If the gods were shadows on Achilles' path, then Patroclus was his light. The war ground on, days blurring into each other in dust and blood. Men fell, heroes rose, the gods interfered, and still the walls of Troy held. Through it all, Patroclus remained at Achilles' side, not always on the battlefield, but always present, a steady anchor amid the chaos. Unlike Achilles, Patroclus did not hunger for glory. His heart was gentler, his pride quieter. Where Achilles sharpened his spear, Patroclus tended the wounded. Where Achilles spoke with fire, Patroclus soothed with calm. Yet their bond was iron, forged in years of companionship, and it was Patroclus who could steady the storm when no one else dared. One evening, as the sun sank red over the sea, the two sat apart from the others. The camp was restless, men bickering, fires burning low. Patroclus poured wine into a cup and pressed it into Achilles' hand. "You push yourself too far," he said softly. "Every day you carve through them like the battle will end in a single stroke. But it doesn't. It won't. This war drags on, and you burn hotter than any of us can endure." Achilles drank, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "What would you have me do? Sit idle? Let others claim my glory? No, Patroclus, my fire is all I have. If I burn brightly, and when I fall, I will fall remembered." Patroclus studied him, his expression unreadable. "And what of those who follow you? What of those who love you?" The words cut deeper than a spear, though Achilles did not show it. He looked away, toward the distant walls of Troy glowing faintly in moonlight. For all his strength, for all his pride, Achilles knew the truth. Patroclus was the one thread binding his humanity. Without him, he feared he would be nothing but fury in human shape. The next day proved it. A Trojan assault struck the Greek camp hard, pushing their lines back to the very ships. The Myrmidons fought like wolves, holding the enemy at bay, but the pressure was relentless. Men shouted that the Trojans would burn the ships, that the sea itself would trap them in defeat. Amid the chaos, Patroclus rode to the wounded, rallying men who would have fled. He carried no spear, yet his courage lifted others. When one soldier fell, he dragged him to safety with his bare hands, ignoring arrows that hissed past his shoulders. He moved through the camp like a quiet flame, steady, unyielding. Achilles watched, pride tightening in his chest. He saw in Patroclus a strength different from his own. Not the strength to kill, but the strength to endure, to heal, to believe. That night, when the Greeks finally repelled the Trojans and the fires burned low again, Patroclus sat beside Achilles, bruised and bloodied, but unbowed. "You see," Achilles said, voice quieter than usual, "you are no less a warrior than I. You do not need the blade to prove it." Patroclus smiled faintly. "I am no Achilles, but I will fight in my way, and I will stand with you, always." The words settled over Achilles like a shield. In a war ruled by gods and kings, where fate itself pressed down on his shoulders, it was Patroclus alone who made him feel mortal. Mortal, and yet not alone. And it was that bond, unshakable and sacred, that the gods themselves would soon test. The war did not move like a straight line. It ebbed, it surged, it turned back on itself, as unpredictable as the sea. And on the 7th day of fighting, the tide shifted hard against the Greeks. The morning began with hope. The sun rose clean and sharp, the air cooler than the days before. The Myrmidons marched out with confidence, their armor gleaming, their ranks unbroken. Achilles himself felt the fire strong in his chest, a certainty that the day would bring him closer to Hector, closer to glory. But the gods had grown restless. Zeus himself, swayed by pleas from Troy, tilted the balance. Dark clouds gathered, though no storm had been forecast by sky or seer. A strange heaviness filled the air, pressing on men's lungs, slowing their limbs. And when the Trojans poured from their gates, it was not with desperation, but with thunder. Hector led them. His chariot surged at the front, his voice carrying over the plain like the call of a king who fought not for glory, but for survival. His men followed with iron resolve, their lines steady, their banners high. For once, the Greeks faltered. The clash was fierce, shields hammered against shields, the dust rising so thick it blurred the sun. Arrows fell in waves, spears hissed through the air. The Greeks, who only days before had roared with confidence, now staggered under the Trojan assault. Their cries turned from fury to desperation as the Trojans pressed harder, driving them back, step by step. Achilles fought like fire, carving a path through the enemy, his blade flashing, his spear piercing shields. But even he felt it. The press was too great, the line too wide. Wherever he struck, another breach opened elsewhere. He could not be everywhere at once. The Myrmidons held, their discipline keeping them alive where others broke. But to their left, the Athenians crumbled. To their right, Menelaus's men fell back in disarray. And always at the center, Hector's chariot thundered forward, his spear a beacon that seemed to pierce not just men, but the spirit of the Greek host itself. The Greeks fell back toward their ships. Dust choked the air, blood slicked the earth, and cries of panic echoed as men stumbled in retreat. For the first time since they had landed on Trojan shores, the thought of defeat, utter, final defeat, pressed into their minds. Achilles raged at the sight. He shouted until his throat tore, his voice raw with fury. "Stand! Do not yield! The ships are our home, our only way back. Will you give them to flame? Hold! Hold or die with shame in your mouths!" His words struck some like lightning, snapping them back to their senses. But others were beyond saving. Fear was a poison, and once it seeped in, no command could purge it. Achilles' horses screamed as he drove his chariot into the thickest knot of Trojans, scattering them like deer before a lion. His spear skewered one, his blade felled another, and still they came. It was as though the city itself had emptied its heart onto the plain, every Trojan fighting with the desperation of those who had no other home to run to. The Greeks stumbled backward to the very edge of their camp. Behind them, the sea lapped cold and relentless against their ships. Before them, the Trojans pressed harder, shouting, "Burn the ships! Burn them, and the Greeks will never return." The air filled with smoke as torches were hurled, sails caught flame, and men scrambled to douse the fires. The crackle of burning wood joined the screams of the dying, a sound that seared itself into every Greek's memory. Achilles' fury boiled over. He cut down Trojan after Trojan, his arms numb from the weight of his strikes. Yet even he could not stem the tide alone. He looked back and saw fear in the eyes of kings. Agamemnon retreating, Odysseus shouting orders to men too scattered to hear, Ajax straining to hold the line with his massive shield. The sight filled him not only with rage, but with contempt. "You call yourselves kings," Achilles spat, his voice like fire. "Look at you, fleeing like children, while Troy sets flame to our very home." But even contempt could not change the truth. The Greeks were being broken. As the sun dipped lower, casting the battlefield in long shadows, Achilles knew the war was slipping from their grasp. The Trojans surged with momentum the Greeks could not match. It was only a matter of time before the ships burned completely, leaving them stranded, defeated, and doomed. And in that hour of desperation, it was Patroclus who stood by Achilles' side, his eyes calm, his voice steady. "If you cannot turn the tide," he said, "then let me try." The words struck Achilles like a spear to the chest. He turned to his brother-in-arms, his companion, his other self. Patroclus did not tremble. He looked upon the ruin of battle and offered himself as the answer. The tide had turned, and with it, fate itself began to shift. The battlefield smoldered. Smoke drifted from half-charred ships, mingling with dust and the sharp tang of blood. The Greeks were desperate, pressed to their limits, their cries more of survival than of war. And in that chaos, Patroclus stepped forward. "Lend me your armor," he said to Achilles, voice steady despite the fire around them. "Let me ride into battle as you. If the Trojans see Achilles' helm, if they believe your fury has returned, their courage will break. We can push them back. We can save the ships." Achilles froze, the request like a knife twisting inside him. His armor, his very skin of bronze, a symbol of his name and his destiny, was not to be worn by another. But Patroclus's eyes held no hesitation. He spoke not for glory, not for his own name, but for the men who burned and bled around them. For a moment, Achilles raged. "No, you would go into the storm that even kings flee from? You would throw yourself at Hector? You would steal my glory?" But Patroclus did not flinch. He placed a hand on Achilles' shoulder, calm as always. "This is not about glory. This is about saving them, about holding the line until you are ready. You cannot fight everywhere at once, but your armor can. Let me wear it. Let me be your shadow." The storm inside Achilles quieted, if only slightly. He stared at his friend, at the man who had walked beside him since boyhood, who had steadied him when his rage burned too hot, who had reminded him he was more than just a weapon. And in that moment, Achilles' pride cracked. "Go," he whispered hoarsely, "but listen to me. Drive them from the ships. Break their charge, but do not pursue them to the walls. Do not seek Hector. That battle is mine." Patroclus nodded, though even Achilles saw the flicker in his eyes. The desire not just to hold the line, but to end the war itself. The armor gleamed as Patroclus donned it, the plumes of the helmet catching the light, the chestplate fitting snug against his frame. To the Greeks, it was as though Achilles himself had returned. A roar spread through the ranks, hope rekindled in their throats. "Achilles! Achilles fights again!" Mounted in Achilles' chariot, Patroclus surged forward. The immortal horses screamed, hooves striking fire from the earth as they thundered into battle. The Trojans faltered at the sight, their courage faltering. They believed it was Achilles himself descending upon them like a god of war, his fury renewed, his wrath unquenchable. And Patroclus fought as though he were Achilles. His spear struck true, felling man after man. His chariot ploughed through the Trojan lines, scattering them like dry leaves before a storm. The Myrmidons rallied behind him, their confidence swelling as they cut through their foes with brutal precision. The tide shifted. The Greeks, moments before on the brink of ruin, surged forward with new strength. They drove the Trojans back across the plain, away from the ships, away from the sea. Flames were quenched, hope rekindled. But Patroclus did not stop. In the heat of battle, in the roar of victory, he pressed harder. His spear struck down Sarpedon, a son of Zeus himself, sending shockwaves through both armies. The gods stirred at the sight, their whispers rising to thunder. And still Patroclus fought on, his blood singing with the power of the armor, with the belief that he could be more than Achilles' shadow. He could be the light itself. He drove the Trojans all the way back to the very walls of Troy. The gates loomed before him, the city trembling at his approach. Men shouted that the Greeks had broken them, that Achilles himself had come to tear Troy stone from stone. And then Hector appeared. The prince of Troy, clad in armor shining like fire, stepped forth from the gates. His chariot wheeled onto the plain, his spear gleaming in the fading light. His voice cut across the din. "You are not Achilles. You are a fool in borrowed bronze." The words struck Patroclus, but his pride surged in defiance. He had fought as Achilles, saved the ships as Achilles, broken men as Achilles. Could he not also stand as Achilles against Hector? The two clashed. Their spears struck. Shields buckled, swords rang as they bit against bronze. Hector was no ordinary foe. His strikes were heavy, his stance unshakable. Patroclus fought fiercely, but the armor did not grant him Achilles' strength, nor his speed, nor his fate. Blow after blow, Hector drove him back, until at last his spear struck true, piercing Patroclus deep. The Greek staggered, blood-staining Achilles' gleaming armor. His vision blurred, his breath ragged. Yet even as death closed around him, he did not fall in silence. "You may kill me," he gasped, voice weak but fierce, "but Achilles will come for you. And when he does, your fate will find you." Hector's eyes hardened. With a final strike, Patroclus fell, the bronze armor of Achilles clattering to the dust. The battlefield froze. A hush swept across the plain, as if even the roar of war itself held its breath. Then the cries rose, Greeks wailing in despair, Trojans shouting in triumph. Patroclus was dead, and with him, the last thread of restraint in Achilles' heart snapped. Far from the clash, Achilles felt it, a tearing, an emptiness unlike any wound. He turned his gaze toward Troy, and though he did not yet see the body, he knew. He knew. The wrath of Achilles was about to become something greater than war itself. The Greek camp was a graveyard of smoke and sorrow. Men stood in silence as the body of Patroclus was carried back, stripped of Achilles' armor by Hector and paraded as a trophy. Not a word was spoken. The weight of grief hung too heavy. And then Achilles saw him. His dearest friend, his brother in all but blood, laid out pale and broken. Patroclus, who had steadied him through every storm, who had fought not for glory but for love of his comrades, was gone. Achilles' heart became a furnace. Not grief, not yet, only rage. His voice ripped across the camp, raw as lightning. "Hear me, Greeks! My wrath has returned. No more will I sit in silence while Troy mocks us, while Hector struts in armor that is not his. By dawn, I will drench the earth in Trojan blood. By dawn, the Scamander River will run red." The men stirred at his words. Even those too broken to raise a shield felt fire kindle again in their bellies. This was what they had prayed for, the return of Achilles. Yet the rage was not enough. Achilles had no armor now. His had been taken by Hector, and without it he could not fight. But the gods had watched, and they had chosen sides. His mother Thetis rose from the sea, her tears mingling with the foam. She went to Hephaestus, god of the forge, and begged for a gift worthy of her son. In the heart of the forge, hammers rang against anvils, sparks dancing like stars. Bronze, gold, and fire fused into a shield unlike any the world had seen. A cosmos in itself, etched with cities and fields, with wars and feasts, with the very life of men carved into its shining face. Armor gleamed brighter than the sun, terrible and beautiful. When Thetis brought it to her son, even hardened warriors gasped. The shield alone seemed to hum with power, the promise of death and glory woven into every strike of the hammer. Achilles donned it, the weight fitting him like destiny. The plumes of his helm shook like flame, his new armor radiant as dawn. When he rose, the camp roared as though a god had descended among them. But it was not only his appearance that struck terror into men. Achilles' grief was a storm that no mortal could stand against. His rage was no longer just his own. It was divine, driven by the knowledge that Patroclus' blood cried out from the dust. When he strode to the walls of Troy, his voice thundered like a war god's. He called Hector by name, cursed the Trojans, swore vengeance so great that not even their rivers would cleanse the stain of it. The Trojans trembled, even their bravest faltered, and Hector himself, though his heart burned steady, knew what had come. The battle erupted again. Achilles did not fight like a man. He fought like fire itself, consuming everything in his path. His spear split shields like clay. His sword cut men down faster than they could flee. He showed no mercy, gave no quarter. The Scamander River swelled with the dead, its waters choked by bodies, its flow turned crimson. The river god rose against him, furious that Achilles had defiled his waters with so much death. But even the river could not quell him. Achilles raged against the current, his shield gleaming against the flood, until the very gods had to intervene, pulling him back lest he be swallowed whole. Still, he returned to the battlefield, unstoppable. Men scattered at the sight of him, some dropping their weapons, others begging for mercy that never came. Achilles did not hear their cries. He heard only the silence of Patroclus, and in that silence, his wrath burned hotter. From the walls of Troy, fathers and mothers wept as they watched him cut through their sons. Wives prayed to the gods for protection, but the gods themselves stood divided. Some pitied Troy, others cheered for Achilles. None dared step fully between him and his vengeance. And at last, the battlefield cleared. Trojans fell back. The Greeks surged forward, and there, standing firm, waiting at the gates, was Hector, the man who had slain Patroclus, the man who wore Achilles' stolen armor, the man who had dared believe he could stand against fate. Achilles saw him, and his rage found its target. The world seemed to fall silent. The clash of armies faded, the cries of men distant. There was only Achilles, wrath incarnate, and Hector, duty-bound prince of Troy. The wrath of Achilles had reached its peak. The duel was coming. The plain before Troy fell silent. Dust clung to the air. Blood soaked the earth, yet all eyes turned to a single point. Two figures stood apart from the chaos, Achilles and Hector. The Greek army parted like a tide, holding their breath. The Trojans clung to the walls, their voices caught in their throats. The gods themselves leaned close, watching, for what was about to happen would echo beyond this war, beyond even Troy. Achilles stood in his new-forged armor, the shield of worlds on his arm, the spear of ash in his hand. He blazed like the sun, untouchable, inexorable. Rage hardened every line of his body. Hector waited at the Scaean gate, armor heavy on his shoulders, plumes trembling in the wind. Behind him, the city, his wife Andromache, his child, his people. Before him, the man whose wrath no mortal could withstand. His face was steady, though his heart thundered. For a moment, he faltered. He turned, glancing toward the gates, toward safety, toward the arms of his family. The thought struck him like a knife. I could live. I could see them again. But honor bound him. The shame of retreat would be worse than death. His people were watching. His name was on the line. And so Hector clenched his spear tighter, his resolve hardening. Achilles advanced, each step ringing with the promise of death. Then Hector broke. He turned and ran. Gasps rose from the walls of Troy as their champion fled, his feet kicking dust. Around the city he sprinted, his armor clattering, the shadow of Achilles pursuing him like doom. 3 times they circled Troy, faster than the wind, the gates looming and fading, the plains stretching endlessly. Hector ran for his life, and Achilles, tireless, chased him, wrath steady and patient. The gods watched with sharp eyes. Zeus weighed Hector's fate on his golden scales, and the scale tipped downward. Death had already claimed him. At last, Athena came to Achilles in disguise, whispering promises into Hector's ear. She tricked him into stopping, into turning to face his fate. Breath ragged, sweat streaking his brow, Hector planted his feet. He leveled his spear. No more running. No more delay. He would stand, and he would fight. "Come, Achilles," he shouted, his voice ringing over the plain. "Let us end this here. Let us give glory to the gods and settle our names in the songs of men." Achilles slowed, raising his shield, eyes blazing with cold fire. His words cut like iron. "You robbed me of Patroclus. You wore my armor. For that, you will pay. No man alive can save you now. Not Priam, not Hecuba, not even Apollo himself. You are mine." They circled, predator and prey, dust swirling at their feet, spears lifted, shields braced. Hector struck first, hurling his spear with all the strength of Troy behind it. The weapon flashed, true and deadly, yet it struck Achilles' shield and glanced away, powerless against Hephaestus' work. Hope fled Hector's face. His hand found his side, searching for another spear, but none remained. His moment of courage had already burned out. Achilles raised his own spear, the ash wood quivering like a living thing. He drew back, every muscle taut, every ounce of rage flowing into that single strike. He hurled it. The spear sliced the air, straight and swift as fate. Hector tried to dodge, twisting away, but Achilles' aim was perfect. The point pierced his throat, just above the collarbone, where no armor could guard. The Trojan prince staggered, blood flooding his mouth. His knees buckled. He clutched the shaft, choking, struggling for air. And then Achilles was upon him, looming above him, eyes cold as steel. Hector gasped, his words broken but clear. "Spare me, by your soul, by your father, by your mother. Do not let my body be left for the dogs. Give me back to Troy. Let my wife, let my child, let my people bury me with honor." But Achilles' rage was not done. His voice was a storm. "No. Did you pity Patroclus as he lay dying? Did you spare him or strip him? You shall have no burial, no honor. The dogs and vultures will feast on you before the gates of Troy." Hector's eyes burned with sorrow, with shame, with the weight of his people watching. And then the light faded, his last breath leaving him, his body crumpling to the dust. The walls of Troy erupted in screams. Priam tore his hair. Hecuba wailed. Andromache fainted at the sight. Their champion was gone. Their doom had begun. Achilles did not stop at victory. He tied Hector's body by the heels to his chariot, the dust rising as he mounted. And then, before the eyes of Troy, he dragged the corpse across the plain, rage still consuming him, fury blinding him to mercy. The Greeks roared, the Trojans wept, the gods turned their faces. The duel was ended. But Achilles' wrath had only deepened. It would not be quieted by Hector's death alone. The battlefield lay still, but not in peace. Hector's body dragged in the dust, pulled behind Achilles' chariot again and again. Each dawn he hitched the corpse anew, circling Patroclus' tomb, venting his fury. The Greeks cheered, but unease crept into their hearts. This was no victory. This was desecration. The gods themselves murmured in disapproval. Even Apollo, who had favored Troy, pitied Hector's mutilated form, shielding the corpse from decay, keeping flesh unbroken by dogs or birds. Day after day, Achilles raged on, blind to their whispers, deaf to the prayers that rose from Troy's walls. Within the city, grief reigned. Priam, king of Troy, tore his robes, ashes staining his head. Hecuba wailed, clutching her chest. Andromache, Hector's widow, staggered through the palace. Her son clutched to her breast, her cries piercing the night. "My husband, protector of our walls, you left me widow, left our child fatherless. He will grow without you, and this city will fall without your shield." The people wept with her, for with Hector gone, the heart of Troy was already broken. Meanwhile, in the Greek camp, Achilles sat alone, his wrath burning but hollow. Patroclus' body had been laid to rest with solemn rites, the funeral pyre rising high, games held in his honor, chariot races, boxing, javelin throws, contests of strength and speed. Achilles presided, but he did not smile. His eyes, once filled with fire, now carried only ashes. Vengeance had not brought him peace. Hector's death had not silenced the grief. Each night, he returned to Patroclus's grave, laying a hand upon the earth, whispering as though his friend might yet hear, "I avenged you. I gave him to the dust. But still, you are gone. Still, I cannot follow." Thetis, his mother, rose from the sea once more. She brought words not of triumph, but of warning. "Son, the gods are displeased. Enough of this rage. Hector's soul has gone to Hades, yet you dishonor him still. End this cruelty, lest their wrath turn upon you." But Achilles clenched his fists, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "I cannot stop. Not yet. My grief is a fire that consumes me." And then, into that fire, walked Priam. Guided by Hermes under cover of night, the old king slipped through the Greek lines, unseen, untouched. He came alone, bearing gifts of ransom, gold, bronze, fine robes, all to beg for the body of his son. When Priam entered Achilles' hut, the warriors gasped. None had expected the king of Troy to step into the lion's den. But Priam came not as a king. He came as a father. He fell to his knees before Achilles, clasping his hands, tears streaming down his withered face. His words broke the silence. "Remember your own father, Achilles. He is old, as I am old. Imagine him, waiting for news of you, fearing each day he may never see your face again. I have lost my son. Give him back to me. Let me bury him. For pity's sake, remember your father and have mercy." The tent stilled. Achilles, who had turned away gods and kings, who had burned with wrath unending, felt the weight of Priam's plea strike through the armor of his rage. His heart cracked. He saw in Priam's grief the mirror of his own, the reflection of what Peleus would suffer when his own fate came. Tears welled in Achilles' eyes. He lifted the old man from the ground, his voice breaking. "You have done what no man has dared. You have touched the heart of Achilles. Take him. Take your son. Bury him with honor. I will not stand in the way." Priam wept into his hands, overcome by both sorrow and relief. For a moment the two enemies sat together, warrior and king, sonless father and fatherless son, bound by grief that knew no borders. Achilles ordered Hector's body to be cleansed, anointed with oils, wrapped in robes, restored to dignity. He forbade any Greek to interfere, honoring the truce he had given Priam. For the first time in many days, a hush of peace settled over the camp. As dawn rose, Priam returned to Troy with his son's body. The city erupted in mourning. Hecuba's cries shook the palace. Andromache collapsed beside the bier, clutching her child, whispering her husband's name. Priam led the lament, his voice breaking though he was king. "Men of Troy, see your protector. See your hero fallen. But though he is gone, we will not forget him." For 9 days they mourned, and on the 10th they built Hector's pyre. Smoke rose into the sky, carrying the soul of Troy's greatest prince into the afterlife. The city wept, but they wept together, united in loss. And in the Greek camp, Achilles watched the smoke from afar, silent. His wrath had cooled, but not ended. The war was not done, though his heart was weary of it. He knew his own fate awaited, soon and sure, for he had chosen it when he chose glory. Yet for that brief span of days, enemy and enemy had touched hands. Wrath had bowed to grief, and mercy, fragile though it was, had flickered in the heart of Achilles. The funeral of Hector was the last peace Troy would know. The smoke of Hector's funeral pyre drifted high above Troy, curling into the heavens. For a moment, the war paused. Both sides mourned, both sides rested. Priam returned behind the walls with the body of his son, and the Trojans closed their gates. The Greeks held their camp in silence, their ships at anchor, their swords quiet. In that fragile lull, Achilles sat by the shore. He gazed across the endless water, waves lapping against the sand, foam spraying over his feet. The sea always called to him, as though it carried the voice of his mother, Thetis. He thought of her warning. Your time is short. If you fight, you will never see your homeland again. And he thought of his father, Peleus, far away in Phthia, old, waiting, fearing the message that would someday come. He thought of Patroclus, who had been more than brother, more than friend. And now, too, he thought of Priam, the broken king who had knelt before him and pierced his heart with pity. For the first time, Achilles felt the weight of his choice not only as glory, but as sorrow. He had slain Hector, but it had not healed him. He had avenged Patroclus, but the emptiness remained. Rage had carried him, but rage alone could not sustain him forever. Yet fate was not to be escaped. The gods whispered of what was to come. Paris, Hector's brother, guided by Apollo, would one day loose an arrow. A simple arrow, not forged by Hephaestus, not gleaming with divine fire. Yet it would find the one spot that armor could not shield, Achilles' heel. This knowledge did not trouble Achilles. He had always known his life would be short. What mattered was how it burned while it lasted. His story would live on, sung by poets, carried by the lips of men through ages. That was enough. But before his end, he lingered in that moment after Hector's death. Half wrath, half weariness, his spirit stretched between vengeance and peace. He walked among the Greeks who looked upon him with awe and dread. No man among them dared meet his eye too long, for they saw both hero and doom. Sometimes, at night, he would sit with Odysseus by the fire. The wily king spoke of home, of Penelope and Ithaca, of cunning plans to end the war. Achilles listened, but said little. What was a home to him now? His home was glory, and glory demanded sacrifice. Sometimes he sat with Ajax, huge and solemn, speaking only in short, heavy words. Ajax did not comfort, nor did he judge. He simply shared the silence, and Achilles valued it more than speeches. But mostly, Achilles sat alone, eyes on the sea, waiting for the tide to carry him toward his fate. In Troy, the people rebuilt their courage. With Hector gone, they felt the walls tremble, but they were not yet broken. Andromache, with her child in her arms, mourned but endured. Priam clung to his kingship, though his heart was shattered. They knew Achilles had become their shadow, the figure that loomed over every gate, every dream. The gods themselves argued over him. Some pitied, some despised, some sought to twist fate, others to enforce it. Yet all knew one truth. Achilles was mortal, and his end approached. When battle returned after Hector's funeral, the fighting was fierce but hollow. The Trojans had lost their champion, the Greeks had gained their fury, and yet even Achilles grew restless. Victory meant less when death lingered at the edge of every breath. He stood often at Patroclus' tomb, speaking softly, his words carried by the wind. I have done as I swore. I avenged you. But I wonder, Patroclus, was it worth it? For each life I take, my own draws nearer. And yet, I would do it again. Always. In dreams, Thetis came to him. She did not beg him to stop, for she knew he would not. She only stroked his hair, as when he was a boy, and whispered, Soon, my son. Soon you will come to me, beyond the sea, and there, no pain will touch you. Achilles woke from such dreams with tears, but also with peace. His rage, though not extinguished, had cooled into embers. He no longer dragged Hector's body. He no longer cursed the Trojans with every breath. He carried instead the weight of knowing that even the greatest flame must flicker and fade. And so the shadow stretched forward. The arrow of Paris waited. The end of Troy drew nearer. The songs of the poets stirred, though they would not yet be sung. But in this span, this single moment after Hector's death, before Achilles' own, there was quiet. A quiet filled with grief, with memory, with reflection. The men of Greece looked upon him and saw a hero. The Trojans looked upon him and saw doom. The gods looked upon him and saw a mortal who had burned too brightly, too briefly. And Achilles, son of Peleus, sat by the sea, listening to the waves, knowing his fate, and walking toward it with unflinching steps. For this was his choice, his life for his glory, his name for his years, his wrath for his story. And though the war would rage on, though Troy's towers would one day fall in fire, this moment remained. Achilles, between vengeance and destiny, poised on the edge of legend. The story of Troy would end in ash and ruin. The story of Achilles would end with an arrow. But the echo of his footsteps on that plain, the fire in his eyes as he faced Hector, the tremor in his voice as he wept with Priam, those would live forever. And so, when we speak his name, when we tell of his wrath, his grief, his choice, we do not only speak of war, we speak of what it is to be human, to rage, to love, to lose, to defy fate even as we walk toward it. That was Achilles. And that is why his story, though born in blood, will never die.